I'm going to talk today about how I catch Mathew Franklin Whittier's plagiarists and imitators. And I'm just going to give a couple brief examples. This shouldn't take too long. Sometimes I have to go to a whole lot of trouble and look at style and look at various indicators. And sometimes I can just catch them red-handed. So I'm going to give an example of each of those, and they're interconnected in this case. So I have explained at length a number of times how I believe Francis A. Durivage and George Pickering Burnham tricked Mathew Franklin Whittier out of the rights to his portfolio, his large portfolio of unpublished work that apparently went back all the way to about 1830. And when they had done that in 1848, they proceeded to publish the entire thing, even things that Mathew never would have wanted to publish, at least not in 1849. The whole thing they published piecemeal, and then they put it in compilations and got money out of it that way. As a matter of fact, Durivage did an interesting little trick. He took the same book, repackaged it with a completely different title, but the exact same book, and sold it again and got money for that again from people that didn't realize it was the same book they already had on the shelf. See, so they were both tricky bastards. But so how do I prove that, though? How do I prove that this huge body of work is actually Mathew's work and not Francis Durivage and George Burnham's? The little ruse that they cooked up to explain why the work was so similar, as a matter of fact, identical in style, is that George Burnham was Francis Durivage's protege. Actually, he was his money bags, I think, is why he was brought in on the deal by Durivage, because he was wealthy. But what they said was, oh, George Burnham is Durivage's protege, and that's why the work looks so similar. Well, it doesn't wash if you look at it closely, but it's difficult to prove. So first of all, they took the pseudonyms, the Olden and the Young'un. Well, that was one of Mathew's favorite phrases. He had certain favorite colloquialisms and phrases that he would use over and over, sometimes more than others. And that was one of them, the Olden, or the little one, or the big one, or whatever. So I did a quick search today, and I'm just looking at pieces that Mathew published before 1848, okay, because otherwise, technically, he could have been imitating. So in Mathew's June 3rd, 1843 piece signed Poins, and Poins I can 100% prove was his pseudonym by means that I've gone into before. He wrote his first piece on the fictional town of Hornby, from which a little later on Ethan Spike originated. That was his known piece. If you look up Mathew and avoid all of the references that are me, you'll find that he's credited by historians with one series about Ethan Spike from Hornby. Well, this is a piece about mesmerism. It's a satirical parody of mesmerism. Later on, I think he accepted it as real, but early on he was skeptical, and this is a skeptical piece about two con artists who pretend to be mesmerists, which is to say hypnotists. And the phrase, the Olden, is used in that. Then, that's 1843. Further back in 1834 and 1835, Mathew wrote the police office reports for the New York transcript, the arraignment hearings, and he turned that into literature. It's actually tentatively attributed to his fellow reporter on that paper. Mathew's name is never mentioned in connection with that paper. I know that he goes way back with the editor, Asa Green. I've gone into all of that. There's no question but what this is Mathew's writing. And in this paper, in the, April 15, 1834, we have the Baden. And then April 11, 1835, Gooden. And in March 14, 1835, Little'un. So clearly, way before 1848, Mathew was using this colloquialism. So that's fine. But then we get into the mesmerism piece and Ethan Spike, all of those above-mentioned pieces that we know definitely were Mathew Franklin Whittier's, according to the historical record and not just my work. And I find a number of phrases and specific spellings, because Mathew would, even though it looked like he was just being sloppy with his English and making these bad spellings and mispronunciations and so on, reproducing the Yankee dialect, he was by and large consistent with his spelling, which imitators were not generally. So we have a list of them here, which are in the Ethan Spike work up to 1848, but which also show up in this book, a compilation published by Francis Durivage in 1853 called The Three Brides, Love in a Cottage, and Other Tales. I pretty much determined that the title piece, The Three Brides, was written by Durivage because he was a sociopath and it's kind of cold. It has to do with a guy not being able to choose between three women, and then he marries them each in succession and each one of them dies, which is not the kind of thing Matthew would have thought was funny at all. But the rest of it is clearly Matthew's. So I looked for phrases that were in this book and also in the Ethan Spike material up to 1848. And I'm going to read the list briefly here. The Olden, of course, Darter for daughter, Natur, N-A-T-U-R for nature. He also spelled it N-A-T-E-R. Pizin, P-I-Z-I-N for poison. He also used variations on that. Sot for sit or set. Fust for first. Kinder for kind of. Winder or winder for window. Spile for spoil. Arter for after. Wust for worst. Orful for awful. Earth, A-I-R-T-H for earth. Leetle, L-E-E-T-L-E for little. Kiver for cover. And divil for devil. And all of those are spelled exactly the same in Matthew's Ethan Spike work and in Durivage's compilation. It's way too much for coincidence because, as I said, if you look at Matthew's imitators, they would be kind of off with these colloquialisms and spellings. Now, just to double check that, I went into a book by, supposedly by George Pickering Burnham. I only have a reprint of that, Gleanings from the Portfolio of the Young'un pseudonym. They put a series of humorous sketches by George Pickering Burnham. In that book, the following from the previous list also show up: Natur, Pizin, Fust, Arter, Orful, and Earth. And that's with the exact spellings. Now, there's another compilation that includes pieces supposedly by both authors, and I don't have a antiquarian copy of that either. Stray subjects arrested and bound over, being the fugitive offspring of the Olden and Young'un that have been lying around loose, quote, and are now, quote, tied up for fast keeping. Well, it's kind of a pun. They're fugitive offspring, all right, in a sense. And who really should be bound over, the real fugitives, are the quote-unquote authors here. But anyway, be that as it may, in that compilation, we also have Fust, Kinder, Spile, Arter, Orful, Earth, Leetle, and Divil for devil. And again, with exactly the same spellings that Matthew used in his published work before 1848. And Durivage and Burnham did not publish anything before 1849. So not anything like this. Matthew ghost wrote for Durivage. And in this portfolio are also these kind of swashbuckling, romantic foreign adventure tales. And those were written by Mathew Franklin Whittier with one or two exceptions. And he had ghost written for Francis Durivage in this same style previously. That's another story. So that's the way that I prove Matthew's authorship of some of these plagiarized works when it's not immediately apparent. And this isn't the only method I use. I can find a lot more circumstantial evidence with regard to Durivage and Burnham than just the method that I've given here. But that's just an example. However, there are other examples where I just catch them red-handed, and that's what I'm going to show you here. Now, sorry, I'd forgotten to print something out, so I had to do that. I'm going to read from a book called The Complete Works of Artemus Ward. It's a biographical sketch of Charles Farrar Browne, who has been sometimes called the first stand-up comedian. a humorist of the 19th century, kind of second half of the 19th century. It's written by Melville D. Landon, and I'm reading from the introduction on page 14. This is having to do with Charles Farrar Browne working as a printer's apprentice for the Carpetbag, which is a humorous magazine in Boston from 1851 to 1853. Mathew was a silent financial partner in this venture, and we know that because Shillaber says so. Now I'm going to read here first from the New York Tribune, December 17, 1893 edition. The late B.P. Shillaber, when talking many years ago of his, quote, Mrs. Partington papers and of other humorous writings of New England, made special mention of the work of Artemus Ward, that's Charles Farrar Browne, and Ethan Spike, which is Mathew Franklin Whittier. He says, we were fellow sufferers together in the Carpetbag venture, he said, alluding to an illustrated comic weekly of Boston by which he and his coadjutors lost much money in an attempt to float it. That means that Mathew was a financial contributor, a heavy financial contributor. I could go into the background of that. I'm not going to. We're just establishing that Mathew was heavily involved in this paper. I've determined that he wrote as many as 8 different pieces for a single weekly edition under different pseudonyms and as different characters. So now we're going to go back to the introduction of this biographical sketch. Actually, it's the biographical sketch is the introduction to the complete works of Charles Farrar Browne, a.k.a. Artemus Ward. So he says, lean, lank, but strangely appreciative, which I don't know what that means. Lean, lank, but strangely appreciative, young Browne used to, quote, set up articles from the pens of Charles G. Halpine. His character was Miles O'Reilly later on in life, I don't think for the Carpetbag, and John G. Sachs, the poet. I don't know why he chose those two, because Mathew was a heavy contributor, even though that was not known historically, but there were a lot more that were known historically that were actually even more famous, like John Townsend Trowbridge and so on. Anyway, he picked those two. Here he wrote his first contribution in a disguised hand, slyly put it into the editorial box, and the next day disguised his pleasure while setting it up himself. The article was a description of a 4th of July celebration in Skowhegan. The spectacle of the day was a representation of the Battle of Yorktown, with George Washington and General Horace Cornwallis in character. The article pleased Mr. Shillaber, and Mr. Browne, afterwards speaking of it, said, quote, I went to the theater that evening, had a good time of it, and thought I was the greatest man in Boston. Okay, so that appeared in the Carpetbag. I've got my notes here. Of April 17, 1852. That's a little bit too late for me to have a physical copy of it, but I've got a digitized microfilm copy of it, which I'll put on the screen. But it so happens that all he did was to find a piece that had been written by Mathew and rework it, just as Charles Dickens reworked A Christmas Carol from what Mathew Franklin Whittier and Abby Poyen Whittier had originally written. But in this case, I can prove it outright. I've got him, okay? Because this was part of the portfolio that Francis Durivage had swindled Mathew out of. And Durivage had already published this in Gleason's Pictorial about a year earlier in the May 17, 1851 edition. So what we're going to do here is first look at that one. Okay, I have an original of that. We have here Gleason's Pictorial Drawing Room Companion, 1851. I'll put it up on the screen for you. And here in the May 17, 1851 edition is, and it's supposedly written for the Pictorial Drawing Room Companion by Durivage. It was actually written by Mathew Franklin Whittier. And again, I've been able to absolutely prove that this was not Francis Durivage's work, okay? But it's you really have to get into it to get the absolute proof. I've just given you little examples there. So I'm going to bring down my light, and I'm going to read the first portion of Duravage's version. He signed it by the old one, but there's no question who that is. It was a great day for Dogtown, being no other than the anniversary of the annual militia muster. Now, Mathew wrote a lot about musters, having been raised Quaker and being anti-military. And on this occasion, not only the Dogtown Blues were to parade upon the village green, but the entire regiment of which they formed a part, commanded by the gallant Colonel Zephaniah Slorky, postmaster and variety storekeeper, was to engage in a sham fight representing the surrender of Cornwallis. There was no attempt at historical costume, but it was understood that Slorky, with his cowhide boots and rusty-plated spurs, his long swallow-tailed blue coat and threadbare chapeau with a cock's tail feather in it, mounted on his $75 piebald mare, apparently a cheap horse, promoted from the plow and dump cart, was the representative of General Washington. Major Israel Peaslee, his second in command, a native of the rival village of Hardscrabble, was to figure as Lord Cornwallis, and the selection was the more appropriate since the private relations of these two great men were anything but amicable, and they espoused opposite sides in politics. Dr. Galenius Jalop, an apothecary and surgeon of the regiment, a man with a hatchet face, hook nose, and thin, weeping whiskers, the color of sugar gingerbread, undertook the character of Lafayette at very short notice, and a very dim conception of the character he had. Shall I go on with another paragraph? I just want to compare it with the other one. The entire population of Dogtown and Hardscrabble turned out to witness the stupendous military operations of the day. On the American side were the Dogtown Blues, with 4 companies of uniformed militia, armed with rifles, fowling pieces, and rusty muskets, and typifying the Continental Army. Their artillery consisted of 2 light field pieces served by a select band of volunteers. These pieces were posted on an eminence commanding the entire plain. On the foot of this hill, Colonel Slorky drew up his troops in the line of battle, his left wing protected by an impassable frog pond, and his right resting on a large piggery whose extent prevented the enemy from turning his flank in that direction. Now, the gist of this is that they get into it, like some reenactors get into it. I've seen that firsthand, actually, when I was videotaping one of these things, that people get into it to the extent that they actually lose sight of the historical context, that they're supposed to be reenacting. And in this case, the fellow that was enacting Cornwallis refused to lose and drove the Washington's troops from the field, see? I'll read the end just to give you an idea. A deafening shout answered his appeal. In an instant, Hardscrabble and its allies were down on Dogtown and its defenders. The latter stood it for a moment, but Peaslee knocked the major off his horse. The surgeon had his nose pulled. The Dogtown Blues justified their name by their looks, and seized with a sudden panic, fled ingloriously from their native training field. The audacious outrage was consummated. History was violated, and General Washington was beaten by Cornwallis. Because another closing paragraph. So that was Mathew Franklin Whittier's work, stolen by Francis Duravage. But thankfully for us, it appears that Duravage did not really modify Mathew's writing very much. He didn't bother, shall we say, or maybe there was something in the contract that forbade him from doing it. I don't know. But anyway, it appears that the material was pretty much intact. So that was probably the way that Mathew wrote it. Now let's look at what Charles Farrar Browne wrote. There's no question that he reworked this piece. He didn't come up with this a year later on his own and write something this similar. So this is supposedly written for the carpetbag, The Surrender of Cornwallis by Lieutenant Chubb. Many years ago, it was a custom in the state of Maine, in most of the towns, to celebrate the memorable event of the surrender of Cornwallis by, quote, going through a mock performance representing that important fact in our country's history. The little town of Waterford, situated upon the banks of the broad and majestic, quote, Crooked River, resolved not to be behindhand in so great an affair. Accordingly, a meeting was called at the old town house on the hill to make the necessary arrangements. Deacon Moses Jones, as he was called, was chosen to enact the character of Washington, and Squire Bijah Woods the character of Cornwallis. The under-officers, soldiers, etc., were to be selected by the selectmen, whose duty it was to furnish uniforms and pay such other expenses as the affair should incur. Now, as Messrs. Jones and Woods are the principal heroes of this sketch, a short description of their characters may not be deemed out of place. You see, the writing is nowhere near as good as Matthew's writing. Deacon Jones was a wealthy farmer, proud and religious, at least he thought he was, and was on the whole a very worthy man. The worst thing about him was a bad habit he had acquired of taking, quote, a drop too much, but then this was not thought a great deal of, for everybody in them days took suthin occasionally. Squire Wood was the village lawyer, very aristocratic, but withal a very clever man. The squire imagined that he knew considerable more than what his neighbors gave him credit for. This may safely be set down as his greatest fault. Both the squire and deacon were proud of their positions in this great affair, and both meant to do their best. The morning of the great day dawned beautifully. The deacon, dressed as General Washington and mounted on his, quote, iron gray, retired with his men, dressed as, quote, Continentals true, at an early hour to a grove near the village where the ceremony was to take place. So the writing is very stuffy, I would say, compared to Matthew's, but clearly he's representing the same event, and clearly he's reworking somebody else's piece. Now, Charles Farrar Browne went on to blatantly imitate Ethan Spike, and he got very good at it. He actually became extremely competent at imitating Ethan Spike, and his politics were in the right place. And I think for that reason, Matthew didn't mess with him. For other reasons, too, because he would have had to try to expose his own original authorship. And Matthew was not exposed as Ethan Spike until 1857, which is far too late to do anything about this. But the Artemus Ward character didn't have the philosophical depth that Matthew had, but he had the politics down and he had the style down. Now, apparently Matthew forgave him because many years later, when Charles Farrar Browne hit the lecture circuit and did routines, Matthew wrote a very glowing review, a very favorable review of him. So apparently there was, no animosity between them. And maybe Matthew took it as imitation as the sincerest form of flattery. What I feel is that as long as his politics were right, then he was working for the cause, and that was okay, But there's no question that he ripped Matthew off here. Now, the only question is, did he get it from Gleason's pictorial, or did he get it directly from Matthew? I suspect he got it directly from Matthew because I think that Matthew was probably mentoring him. This must have happened, I don't know, a dozen times that I've run into, that Matthew would be mentoring someone and that person would not resist the temptation to take the samples, the unpublished samples that Matthew gave this person, and just publish them as his own. This happened a number of times. Well, I think that's pretty much what happened here with Charles Farrar Browne. He didn't actually publish it, intact, but he said, I'm going to rework this and publish it on my own. But obviously he never admitted it. He basically remained officially proud of it all his life, and it ended up in his, in his book by his biographer. So we've caught him red-handed, no question. And now trying to get historians to change this is like pulling teeth. You can't. You cannot change the historical record. It's set in concrete. Even if you can flat out prove it like this. Matter of fact, I recently proved it to a scholar who seemed to be amenable to talking to me. But after I sent him this, he wouldn't write me back. I mean, he did write back with something that didn't make any sense and said that he, was just busy or something. And since then, he hasn't written me back. So he cut off communication. And I think it's because, when you prove that the status quo is flat out wrong about anything, even a little thing, like George Burnham supposedly having written The Rag Picker or Bound and Free, which was Mathew Franklin Whittier's work. One of his crowning achievements was unsigned in 1855. And George Burnham, 2 months later, came around and by trickery tried to associate his name with it. It didn't work at the time, but it stuck historically because some librarian found it and penciled his name in the front. And now George Burnham is considered the author, which is absurd. I can flat out prove that he couldn't possibly have been the author of that work. And yet I can't get anybody to touch it with a 10-foot pole. They will not go up against the status quo. Once it's gotten into the system, they will not take it out. So same thing goes with this. I can flat out prove that Charles Farrar Browne did not write this piece, this first piece, that historians say that he slipped into the Boston Carpetbag. Well, he slipped it in all right, but he didn't write it. He just reworked it. Well, that's all. I won't make this go any longer. I just wanted to give examples of the hard way and the easy way. The hard way when I really have to go in and compare style and compare a great many indicators. And the easy way when I just catch them red-handed. There's a bunch of examples of that. The major plagiarists, unfortunately, were quite tricky, like Edgar Allan Poe. You have to go in and you can catch them, but, it isn't easy. Like the philosophy of composition is manifestly a piece of bullshit, and you can go in and prove that that's a piece of bullshit, but then they have an excuse for that. Oh, he was jesting, it was a parody or something. Well, he was laughing up his sleeve because he knew damn well he hadn't written it. So in that sense, he was joking. But that's the only sense in which he was joking, because that's the way he understood how to write poetry, which could not possibly be the way that The Raven was written. So it's manifestly obvious that Edgar Allan Poe could not possibly have been the author of The Raven. And yet it's so deeply embedded in the status quo that you could never get anybody to take it out. Right now, people are looking at my paper about The Raven, but they don't write me. They don't dare write me, I guess, They'll look at it and they'll look at it, and people all over the country will look at it, and nobody will write to me. With this unbelievable discovery that I've made, nobody will dare to even write me and discuss it with me. See, very interesting situation. All right, that's enough for now. And I think I'll probably give these a break for a little while, and we'll see what comes next.